Lord Bichard, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Powell and I'm the RICS Executive Director of Product Development. And I'd like to welcome you all here this evening to the RICS for the inaugural CPD Foundation Harris Debate. Just a brief amount of housekeeping before we start. If I could ask you all to either turn mobile phones off or onto silent. Thank you very much. We're not expecting any fire drills this evening, so in the unlikely event the fire alarm does go off, the two fire exits are one here and one at the back of the room, down the stairs, and we assemble outside the building underneath the statue of George Canning. You might like to know that this event is actually being filmed and streamed live across the internet, and it will be recorded and made available on the CPD Foundation website after the event. So, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our host for the evening, RICS President-elect, Louise Brooks-Smith.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. I put my glasses up here just in case. I'm trying to desperately not wear my glasses tonight. So, Lord Bichard, distinguished panellists and ladies and gentlemen, may I start by welcoming you to the RICS, for those of you who've not been here before, and to this evening's debate on ethics. Now, some of you will be aware, this building is home to a profession founded on technical and ethical standards. Indeed, these are embodied in our Royal Charter and in our corporate strategy. The RICS enjoys the enormous privilege of being a self-regulated body, something which has been highlighted in recent weeks as the press self-regulation debate has progressed. Our members, wherever they operate, are required to demonstrate high standards of ethical behaviour and are held to account if they fall short. So tonight's debate could not be more relevant. Ethics can appear disarmingly simple to define. A common definition is a social, religious or civil code of behaviour considered correct, especially that of a particular group, profession or individual. But what might seem straightforward for dictionary writers can be a very difficult concept in practice. Potter Stewart, a former Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, said simply that ethics is knowing the difference between what you have the right to do and what is right to do. Indeed, ethics have been the subject of educated debate since ancient times. Deep within us is a sense that the right thing can somehow be defined and explained. While this may be true, does our definition of ethics vary between societies? Is it constant over time, or do ethics change with fashion and social responsibilities? As business, technology, science and society make rapid advances, what are the implications for our ideas about ethics? They have been at the forefront of political and public discourse in recent years. I only have to mention the mis-selling of financial products, the apparent fixing of interbank lending rates, abuse of public funds, and elements of the media behaving irresponsibly and at times illegally. Are these signs that ethical standards are being eroded? Or is the widespread public disquiet proof that a sense of ethical standards and a desire to maintain them is actually growing? For all professionals, ethics goes to the heart of maintaining our respective reputations. Clients and employers need to know that they can trust professional advice. Trust is what underpins transparency, and that leads to trust-inspiring confidence. We therefore need to define standards of ethical behaviour, and we need to identify and disseminate best practice. Increasingly, these standards and practices have to be understood and applied across geographical and societal boundaries, just as business and every other area of human activity becomes ever more interconnected and indeed global. So too should our ideas about ethics and their practical application. I contend that we need a worldview, as it's becoming increasingly difficult to view ethics from the perspective of one country, religion or culture. It follows that we need to understand the legislative trends within different markets. We need to understand how legislation is increasingly applicable across jurisdictions. These are some of the areas that I think we hopefully will touch on this evening. We have an eminent panel of professionals, and I look forward to hearing their insights into a lively debate from the many professionals who are here tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, to guide us through the questions, I'm delighted to introduce Lord Bichard, who will chair our panel. Lord Bichard has been a crossbench peer since March 2010. He's enjoyed a long and distinguished career as a public servant, serving as a CEO of Brent Council, Gloucestershire County Council and the Benefits Agency. He was also Permanent Secretary of the Department for Employment and its successor, the DFEE. Now, since retiring from the civil service, Lord Bichard is perhaps best known for chairing the Bichard Inquiry in 2004. He is chair of the Social Care Institute for Excellence, popularly known as SCI, a charity funded by the Department of Health and the devolved administrations in Wales and Northern Ireland. SCI identifies and disseminates knowledge and good practice and all aspects of social care throughout the United Kingdom. With such a background, I can only begin to imagine the many ethical dilemmas Lord Bichard has encountered in his career. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lord Bichard, who will introduce you to our panel. Thank you.
I always worry about introductions. I was introduced recently to an audience of chief constables by another chief constable who said, and I'm so pleased to have Michael Bichard. He is, of course, well known to the police. Thank you for avoiding that one. I'm delighted to be here, actually for a number of reasons. The first, actually, is because this debate, I think, is the inaugural of a series of annual events which have been organised in recognition of the contribution and the commitment which Jonathan Harris has made in the field of continuing professional development and lifelong learning, and in particular his work in forming, developing the CPD Foundation, which has now been offering annual programmes of lectures for an astonishing 30 years. I was a bit worried, Jonathan, when I saw my original briefing notes, which refer to the Jonathan Harris Memorial Lecture, and you and I had lunch not that long ago, so I was reassured that you were still with us. His contribution, let me tell you, has been immense. His determination to communicate the importance of CPD for professionals, the need to keep up to date, has been, I think, unparalleled. And I know that the aim is that these annual events should mirror his approach by taking subjects which have a wide relevance to the professions and exploring those with panels as eminent as the panel we have tonight, and I'll introduce those good people in a moment. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for making all of this possible, and it's good to see you looking in such good health. Louise has already said tonight's debate is around ethics. Ethics Lost in Translation is the title. And as you say, Louise, it could hardly be better timed. It is important for all of us as professionals to demonstrate ethical behaviour and to demonstrate integrity. I think that's what sets us apart from others in the marketplace and always has set us apart. But, as you touched upon, we're experiencing perhaps an unprecedented breakdown of integrity in many of our most important institutions. Yes, there have been immense failures in the banking sector, which at times has been close, it seemed, to being amoral in the way that it markets its products. There have been awful breakdowns of trust and integrity in Parliament, with members apparently willingly claiming expenses just dishonestly. In the press, in the BBC, the police, and even in the church, with its shameful failures to confront and deal with child abuse. These are really worrying trends, and we have to ask ourselves, is this unprecedented? Are we going through a quite unprecedented period and breakdown in integrity? Why? Why have these occurred? And I'm particularly interested in, is there anything practically we can do to stem the flow as professionals and in other fields? I, for example, feel that maybe we've lost sight of integrity and values in our education system, such as our emphasis upon literacy, skills, and numeracy. So how are we going to address these issues? And how are we going to address those issues in an increasingly global marketplace? How are we going to ensure consistency but also respect cultural diversity? Well, these are some of the questions that I'm sure we are going to touch upon tonight. As I said, our panel is eminent, no pressure. They're each going to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and we then want to hear from the audience, because there is tremendous experience and knowledge in the audience today, and we want to make this a debate. I'm going to introduce them all together so that we don't keep interrupting. We've got Philippa back, who's been Director of Institute of Business Ethics since 2001, has over 30 years of experience of business as a Group Treasurer and Group Finance Director in a number of UK and international companies, and started her career at Citibank. She speaks widely on business ethic issues. She encourages high standards of business behaviour based on ethical values, and I can't think we could have anyone better to start the debate. Ken Creighton from RICS, the Director of Professional Standards. Ken directs RIC's contribution to the development of international standards. He oversees their education and qualification standards and the technical standards which are developed in their 17 professional groups. And he's particularly well positioned, I think, to touch upon this issue of cultural diversity and standards on an international stage. And thirdly, Robert Barrington, Executive Director of Transparency International UK. He joined them in 2008. He became Executive Director in 2013. And his areas of expertise include the Bribery Act, corruption in the UK, and corruption in the private sector. So he's not short of things to focus upon. He's edited many Transparency International publications, including Anti-Bribery, Due Diligence for Transactions, and Corruption in the UK. So Philippa is going to open the session, and at the end of the 3 contributions, we will ask you to contribute to a wider debate. Philippa, over to you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Lord Bichard, thank you for your kind words of introduction. I thought I would, well, tonight I see my role actually in the 5 to 7 minutes, as I've been told, and I have my watch here to try and keep me on time. Really to set the scene a little bit with some a little theory and a little practice, which I think will then be illuminated by what Ken and Robert then have to say. If I may, some of you may not be familiar with the Institute of Business Ethics. We are a charitable organisation founded in 1986, really helping organisations today with their ethics programmes and their strategies. But as Louise started with the definition, I too like to start with the definition. What is business ethics? And I think ours is slightly simpler in that we always talk about it's the application of ethical values to business behaviour. Very simple. It's all about how you do your business, how you interact with other people, how you do you pay your suppliers on time, all those good issues about which you may be tested, as it were. But when we talk about ethical values, we're talking about certain sort of words. Companies typically will have 2 to 3 words of an ethical nature, balanced with some business value words in their purpose and the way that they do their business. So typical words are integrity, and from Rick's point of view, you'll certainly understand that word, because if buildings do not have integrity, they tend to collapse. We talk about words of openness, transparency. The two are different. I encourage companies to be open. They cannot, for commercial reasons, always be transparent. And then we come to words like trust and trustworthiness. Buzzwords today, very much very important words, but to bear in mind, actually, you have to earn trust. So actually saying you wish to be trustworthy is far more impressive than actually saying you have trust. The two are different. We spend quite a bit of time at the IBE actually dissembling words and dissembling meanings. And that brings me to another point, which is really around what are we talking about, back to this relationship point of view. We're talking about organizations doing business ethically. Very different from organizations doing ethical things. Now, that's not to decry from actually doing the things part, because that's very important. Philanthropic work, working with schools, the Computers in Schools programs, environmental issues, and social programs, all very important that companies play their role in society, but actually fundamentally, are they doing their business ethically? Back to the relationships and how they're doing it. I was chairing an event this afternoon for Biz about late payments. The whole issue of companies, are they paying their suppliers on time? It's a hot debate at the moment, and that is one of those tests that we would see if companies are not doing their business ethically. They tend to fall foul of that one. But looking at trust and reputation together, there are two ways of looking at it. So, it's important to look from the outside in as an organisation. And if we study the business model as it's developed over years, the first model was very much trust me. We lived in a paternalistic environment. Companies were trusted. And one doesn't have to go back that many years when that was very much the situation. Probably the late 80s was the last time when a company could say, trust me, and people might. It then sort of moved forward, and companies felt, public felt uncomfortable, so they started saying, well, show me how you're doing your business. Still, we had some ethical lapses. Involve me. I want to be involved in what you're doing. I want to know what you're doing. Now, at the moment, we're very much in the prove to me environment, and of course, finally, if companies, individuals, or professional bodies do not prove satisfactorily to society as a whole, then through the democratic process we get more laws and regulations, and we end up in an environment of obey me. Looking at it also from the outside in, you've got the customer viewpoint, and that is very much about being trustworthy, people making that trusting act, whether as an individual chartered surveyor or whether as a company to whom you're outsourcing your reputation, expecting your supply chain to deliver on time and to how you want things to be done. So business ethics at the basic level is all about doing the right thing, and it's working with an environment of staff who majoritively want to do that. Typically, it's only a small number of people who don't want to do that. And it sees, again, trust and reputation played out in some of the headlines that we see coming through, and Louise has actually alluded to that already. So what are companies doing as a practical point of view? Well, many of them do have a very strong ethics program, code of ethics. It will cover issues like gifts and hospitality, bribery and corruption, which Robert will be covering. Also issues like conflicts of interest, human rights, and many, many more. Companies are exploring their culture. They're beginning to ask themselves the questions, what are the ethical issues that are facing us? What should we be worried about? What could come and grab us, as it were, in this 24/7 world? But having codes, they are necessary, but they're not always sufficient. But codes based on values aligned to the way that the company does its business certainly go a lot further than just having a list of do's and don'ts or a glossy little brochure. If they're seen, those values are seen to be a seamless thread through the organisation, through the leadership, the tone they're setting, through behaviours, through examples set, all the way down to how decisions are taken, how the support mechanisms work. Can people speak up freely? Can they raise their concerns? Can they talk about wrongdoing without fear of retribution or retaliation? Those are the main elements that companies are trying to achieve in a practical sense. And there's certainly research around resilience. Research in the States show that companies who have a strong code of ethics, the levels of observed misconduct in those companies tends to be down at about, say, the 30% level. You might still think that's high, but companies with weak codes of ethics, it's up in the high 80s, 86, 87%. When you've got pressures to compromise, those with weak codes tend to be at 7%, i.e. people want to do the right thing, but those with weak codes tend to be at 37%, i.e. the pressure is on and they think they can get away with it. I was also asked to comment on what industry-wide initiatives are out there, because I know Ken is going to allude to this. There are three that I'd like to mention. One is in the defence sector, IFBEC, as it's known as, which is the International Forum for Business Ethics Conduct in the defence and aerospace industries, a global initiative. which the Transparency International and a colleague of Robert's has also been involved in. Then we've got a new one that's launched earlier this year called the Banknote Ethics Initiative, BNEI, which was launched in May. And this goes further. This actually says you cannot be a member of that organisation unless you've had a third-party audit into their, against matching your progress against their code, their voluntary code that they have set up, which looks particularly at anti-bribery and also competition issues. And then there's a further one which is slightly broader, looking at that say-do gap between what companies say they're doing and the employees' experience, again based on third-party audit, is investing in integrity, which I have an interest in because it was set up with the Institute of Business Ethics and the Chartered Institute of Securities Investment. So in summary, in this 24/7 world, companies really do need to think. They need to have a really good idea about what are the ethical issues they're facing and how they are going to help their staff to make sure that they are not going to be doing the wrong thing when nobody's watching. They are going to grow that trustworthiness and actually to align themselves with the societal expectations, which are much higher now than they have ever been. The Institute does a number of surveys, and we've got one that will actually be issued in a couple of weeks' time, but I can give you some headline figures. It's a survey that we have run for the last 10 years, and the results actually are quite interesting. We ask one question: how ethically do you think British business generally behaves? Back in 2003, 47% of people thought that British business behaved ethically. Last year, it was at 48%. It went up in the meantime and then back down again. But surprisingly, this year in September, the results came out at 59%. Now, that was a real shock to us, given all the noise that has been going on this year and the headlines. But another question that we asked, which really I think is the telling one: how do you think British business is behaving now compared with 10 years ago? That's a question we only asked for the first time in 2006. At that level, 30% thought that companies were behaving more ethically in 2006 than 10 years previously. And if we look at this today, that has fallen now to 25%. And that has been a continual downward trend. So whilst people might believe that companies are behaving ethically, if you ask them that comparison question, it's a downward trend. So there's nowhere to hide for companies. There's a lot of work for them to do to rebuild trust. And we hope that tonight's debate will actually add to that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ken.
Thank you. Good evening. I'd like to make an announcement tonight. We will be creating an international standard of ethics for our profession. Let me explain. Other professions have truly international standards for ethics, and our profession does not. It's not to say we don't have ethics. We do. Our ICS, for example, has ethics. We have ethics that are robust and proven and regulated. But as a profession, as a complete profession, we do not have an ethics standard. The accountants do. IFAC has an ethics standard, and all the accounting bodies that sign up to IFAC follow that standard. What we are doing is following a model that has proven successful to create standards like this. A little bit about myself. I joined, as you heard, RICS 2 years ago, and I came from the Accounting Standards Center, the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation. And IFRS went from 0 countries following IFRS to over 120 just about 10 years later. And they did so because the accounting professional bodies and the accounting firms all work together to support one standard, if you will, a monopoly of standards, of a standard, IFRS. Now, underneath that, the accounting bodies compete with each other. Of course they do. They compete with who can implement that standard better But in doing so, there's one financial reporting standard around the world, and that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. This is the same model that we're following to create robust, quality, sustainable international standards in our profession. We're actually doing this in 3 areas: valuation, measurement, and ethics. Now, valuation is a little further down the road. International valuation standards exist. There's the Red Book. We implement them. They're not accepted around the world. We're working on that, but that's a project that is ahead of measurement and ethics. Measurement, I'd like to explain, because it does directly relate to ethics, and I think it relates to potential ethical problems within our profession. By measurement, I'm talking about physical measurements. The chairman of our commercial property board is here. Simon is smiling at me. We spoke about, he led a day-long conference yesterday, and we spoke about this in some detail. This is about the fact that if we had 10 professionals following different standards from around the world measuring this very room, we might come out with 10 different answers. Do you measure from the outside of the wall to the outside of the wall, or the inside of the wall to the inside of the wall, or carpet area, or net carpet area? Whatever that is, it exists, trust me. Where is this wall right here? Is it at the window? Is it at that column? Where is that wall? Not to say that any of those professionals would be wrong, it's just that we have totally inconsistent numbers. So a potential buyer of this room receiving different measurements would have different numbers, and what would they do? Now, there's lots of interesting examples about this around the world, about using car parks or not using car parks, or counting floors that the foundation could support, not the ones that exist. But I heard one today that I thought was shockingly true, and it has to do with maybe a developing economy called New York City. And did you know that the net lettable area can be measured by the nose of the gargoyle? Yet gross external area is the outside wall. Net lettable area is bigger than gross external area. I mean, I have a visual of that gargoyle being Pinocchio and having that. I just heard that today. I thought it was amazing. But there are not just the gross differences, but the detailed differences about whether you include the hallways and the toilets and the lifts and the shared space and so forth. So our profession, if you follow our ICSS standards, you're fine, right? We have good, consistent standard. But in the profession, we are just pouring bad, inconsistent data up into valuations and up into financial reporting. The good news is we're doing something about it. We have invited and received yeses from 23 organizations from every major economy in the world. North and South America, all over Asia, Europe, Africa, 23 bodies. The IMF is a part of this. We had a launch at the World Bank. We are going to produce IPMS, International Property Measurement Standards, in June of 2014. And then we're going to move into other sectors and other areas of measurement. As context, we're going to do the same thing in ethics. Many of the same bodies are already committed to doing this with us, and a few other new ones that we're pulling in. And we're having an event that's not yet decided, or the location or the exact theme. We're literally approaching this the same way we did with measurement, to say, look, we have a great standard. You have a standard that you think is great, and that's not the point. Let's come together and let's start from scratch and create a standard that will last for all time. Let's work together. And let's do it in our own interest, in the public's interest, in the market's interest, and it's a good thing. And we've gotten a lot of positive response for that, and so it will happen. So keep your eye on that. So that's what we're doing on international standards, and international ethics standards will be at the heart of that initiative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. For those of you who don't know Transparency International, this isn't an advert, it's merely an infovert, or whatever they are. It's a bit of information. We're a global anti-corruption organization, and we operate in around 100 countries. We have chapters based in those countries. And if you haven't heard of us, you might have heard of the thing that we're most famous for, which is every year we produce a list of countries around the world, which ranks them in order of who is most and least corrupt. So that's often used as a corporate risk assessment tool, and companies in particular tend to be quite familiar with that. And I face every day in my job, as to my fellow chapter heads worldwide, the question of how do we eradicate global corruption? That's a pretty big ask, of course. And what I want to talk about in the few minutes I've got is some of the challenges and opportunities I see in that. And I'd like also, if you could all put on that hat of, imagine you're the head of a TI chapter somewhere in the world, asking this question, how do I eradicate global corruption? I'd be very interested in any answers you come up with, because they're generally very helpful to us. Well, there's this interesting question of ethical relativism, I think, which plays out in two ways for Transparency International. The first is the relativism between the private sector and society. And to put another way, you might ask the question, why do companies act differently to people when companies are actually made up of people? And particularly in the area of corruption, you might ask, why does a company allow its employees to pay bribes, to act corruptly in various parts of the world, when one hopes the individuals within that company wouldn't be particularly satisfied? The CEO of the company might not be satisfied to know that his or her children, probably his children being the CEO, are growing up in a world in which judiciaries can be bought by the highest bidder, in which you can't get proper law enforcement if you can't pay a police officer, in which any job you might want to get, any access to university or healthcare can only be obtained if you pay a bribe. That's not the kind of world that most people want to grow up in or want their children to grow up in. So why do companies pay bribes that allow that kind of world to happen? I don't have the answer to that, but that's, I think, the ethical relativism here between society and companies. There's also the relativism, which I think is particularly interesting, between country and country, especially in regard to corruption. And that's because when you look at our list of which countries are most and least corrupt in the world, you'll see that a depressingly large number of countries appear as red on our world map, and that means pretty corrupt. Sometimes very, very corrupt. Yet these are the countries to which we are asking global companies to export and in which we want them to operate. How do they operate there? How do we as individuals operate there, given the levels of corruption? One of the most seductive and beguiling arguments, which I hear very frequently, is, well, country X, corruption is normal. In fact, we're doing them a favor by paying bribes in that country. We're somehow helping them because it's the way they operate there. The people are corrupt and we're just being sympathetic to the local environment. Well, you could try that argument on my other 99 chapter heads worldwide, and you'll find you'll get pretty short shrift. And one of the reasons for that is because they, of course, come into contact with citizens day in, day out, who are themselves the victims of corruption in those countries. We say at TI there is no such thing as a corrupt country. There are corrupt people, and corrupt people make corrupt societies. Not because the rest of society want to be corrupt, but because they get caught up in it. And the most corrupt people are usually the most powerful people and the richest people, and that makes it very difficult for individuals in those countries. Well, taking on this question of relativism between countries and how is one corrupt and another apparently not corrupt, there's an interesting emergence in recent years of global standards about corruption or fighting corruption, a UN Convention Against Corruption dating only from 10 years ago, an OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, the UK Bribery Act. There is an emerging body of law which actually lays to rest this idea that somehow it's okay to be corrupt in certain countries. But of course laws are only as good as the enforcement of them and as people's understanding of them. And so here are some other trends which I think are quite encouraging in this space of corruption. The first is the rise of the social media. And Philippa mentioned the words, there is nowhere to hide. I think we see this nowhere better than in the rise of the social media and corruption, that actually if you're a company or an individual and you pay a bribe these days, you've got to assume you're going to be found out. Now, maybe through WikiLeaks or Mr. Snowden or all number of ways, but actually the opportunities for these things to come to the fore are really huge these days in a way that didn't exist. And one of the most exciting things for us in the anti-corruption movement is this sort of sense of citizen empowerment, that citizens are so often the victims of corruption and of poor ethical standards, but now there is some opportunity for them. I don't want to exaggerate it, because of course they're still victims in many countries, but there's something there, something that will grow, and that's, I think, an encouragement. Secondly, in addition to the legal standards that are springing up, there are global norms for business. We've seen them in human rights and various other ways, but certainly in corruption, there's a sense that global companies, responsible global companies, are going to operate in the same way around the world, irrespective of what the local law says. And that, I think, has to be a very positive thing. And finally, there's better enforcement worldwide. So if you do get you do come to the fore through the social media and the laws in place, then actually the chances of some enforcement have vastly increased over how they were 10 years ago. Well, what do I make of all this? I'm going to ask the question, what makes a difference? What can make a difference? Because despite these advances in what we might call ethics, we still live in a world in which there is a large amount of corruption, and companies and individuals are complicit in that every day. Three things I think either do make a difference or could make a difference. The first is whistleblowers. That actually more corruption cases come to light worldwide through whistleblowing than anything else. But we protect whistleblowers very badly. In fact, generally, they have a terrible, terrible lot in life. They get harassed at work, dismissed, they can become victims themselves. They should be the heroes, so we need to change that equation somehow. Secondly, I'd like to see more people going to prison, particularly directors of corrupt companies. We've been terrible at that, absolutely terrible. There are corrupt companies in this country whose directors have not gone to jail. Why is that? Well, you might say there are bad laws. We might say there's lack of political will. But I think there's nothing going to encourage better behavior by other companies than seeing our corporate leaders who have behaved corruptly or allowed their companies to behave corruptly in jail in orange jumpsuits. And finally, there's this question of leadership. I think leadership is absolutely the critical part in this. You can have whatever laws you want in place for ethics, but you can't govern ethics by laws. It's got to be about individual values and culture. And we need a generation of political and corporate leaders who have that. When I look as Transparency International across the world, I see some really shining beacons of good leadership in companies and sometimes in politics, but also a depressingly poor lot of leaders in many political positions and in many companies. Somehow, as a society, we need to do better in that. Thank you.
I'm now going to throw it open. I mean, not just questions, but contributions. Let's have a discussion about this. It's always 10 seconds before anyone puts their hands up. So I've got one advantage, because I'm being tweeted here. And I think in relation to what you've just said, I mean, one of the questions that's come in from Ben Hull is merely adhering to legislation, for example, the anti-bribery laws. Is that the same as acting ethically? Who would like to comment on that? Anyone out there want to comment on that?
I mean, I'll have a go. I think it's clear from what I said that I don't think it is the same. I mean, you absolutely need the legal framework in place, and that's critical. And it's great news from TI's point of view, I think, that we've got a bribery act in the UK and similar legislation in other countries worldwide. But have we seen that companies have stopped paying bribes? No. You've got to have a lot more than that. Without the law, of course, you're on a hiding to nothing. But once you've got the law, that's the first step in a long journey. It's not the end of the journey.
I would certainly add to that. I think it's the base minimum is the law. It's actually how companies choose, because all companies have a choice, all individuals actually have a choice of how they're going to behave, and if they choose to do the right thing, then they're behaving above the law, and they will not make bribes in that corruption.
I very much agree with your point about sanctions as well. I mean, as someone who sits in the law, it's actually quite embarrassing. There's people still sitting there who fiddle their expenses because we can't get rid of them, because we can't do it retrospectively. And I just think that sends out entirely the wrong message. But you're quite right. It's the same situation that we have in many companies, I think, in this country.
Just to add to that, I think that to support what's said, in the same way that there's a difference between setting rules and expecting professionals to do the right thing following, for example, principle-based standards, and that if you try to, the industry I came from was accounting. US accounting sets out a lot of rules, and then you end up with Enron, because you get very smart people who follow all the rules. They don't break a single one, but they find out how to get around them. And they didn't do anything wrong, but were they unethical? Of course. So yeah, I think there's a big difference.
Just tell us who you are, that would be helpful. Yeah.
Dennis Prairie-Gray from Exeter. Thank you very much for organising this debate. I think it's very topical because it affects all the professions. And thank you also for letting a couple of medics in from the West Country. And as one of those, I think medicine may offer an interesting test case of a profession in considerable trouble, where it has a very clear and very strong ethical code. It is regarded as the most trustworthy group of people in the whole of society repeatedly. But we are having a series of terrible scandals, which have to be seen as ethical failures. And in Staffordshire Hospital, for example, a foundation trust, supposed to be an elite hospital, a board of directors was instructed by the health service centrally and by the regulator monitor to cut cost at all cost. It did so. It sacked enough nurses to reduce the quality of care so that it failed totally. Fully qualified doctors and nurses on the wards did not blow the whistle, with one or two distinguished nursing exceptions. And so my question really to the panel is, we had the codes, but they didn't work on the ground. And how far was that board of directors responsible, particularly when it was guided by a Department of State and a regulator to do what it did? How far were those doctors and nurses on the wards culpable? I think most of us think they were, but what on earth can we do to protect them and get it to stop again? And is whistleblowing in fact the answer? Because in my profession, whistleblowers are savaged.
I'm happy to start with that one. Until a few years ago, sat as a director on the Foundation Trust Hospital Board. And of course, seeing all those horrific news coming out, we were very concerned, could it happen here, etc., etc., and as you can imagine, spent some time thinking about that. I think the comfort we took, actually, was in the leadership. The lady who was chief executive of the hospital, which we had put in, we'd replaced the previous incumbent when we became a Foundation Trust, with this lady who had actually been the finance director, which you might think is, well, okay, numbers going into there, but I have never seen anybody so empathetic with the hospital. She'd been there a number of years, and I can tell you she had did the training, so that because in the area of the country it's in, a very high elderly population, she undertook the training for feeding on the elderly patients ward. She, together with the chairman and other directors of the hospital, were involved in the audit process and would go around and check, are the bedpans clean? And they went around, and I can tell you that everybody saw in the hospital. And if you actually had lunch with Anna, you couldn't have lunch with Anna because she knew everybody knew her, and she was talking with them all. She knew what had happened to their brother, their mother, and so on and so forth. And we collectively on the board felt it was very unlikely that we would ever have that sort of problem as in Staffordshire because of the collective way that both sides of the hospital were working. It was indivisible between medical and admin. So to me, the answer is leadership, and actually seeing that in working at ground level.
I mean, I have a lot of sympathy with that view, but let me challenge you a little bit. Because none of you have mentioned the issue of targets and the pressure that short-term targets and the need to achieve those have. Now, there's no excuse, of course, for corrupt behaviour, but have we gone too far in terms of applying pressure to people?
We have at some level. Certainly when I first joined the hospital, it was all about targets, the 18-week and the 4 hours, and so on and so forth. I think we felt quite relieved that we weren't in the city centre because, you know, the number of drunks turning up, you can't sober up a drunk if you always.
I'll take your word for that.
I've tried it personally, but I've been reliably informed. And of course, in the city centre area, you know, they tend to end up at the A&E much more easily than if you're out of centre. But I think the targets were driving it, and one could see that the responsibility to the sense of where is the patient in this. And I once was overheard at saying that these these targets and discussions around them were not doing my blood pressure any good. And somebody turned around and said, well, you're in the right place. But it was soul destroying, because that is no way to run an organisation, that you see unprofessional behaviour because they think they're doing the right thing by hitting the target. Because it was black and white, you don't hit it, you lose money, whatever might be the effect. And I think that is disastrous. You get what you get.
It's this issue of short-termism, isn't it? Because targets have been particularly an issue in the public sector, but actually if you look in the private sector, the pressure to achieve short-term results, you know, raises the stakes. And does that, are we too short-termist? I know it's a rather cliche, but is this having an impact on people's behaviour to the point where it's of concern?
I mean, if I may, I think you're right that the targets are a problem in a number of ways. I mean, with regard to corruption specifically, we see in the public sector in the UK, actually, there are certain targets which seem perverse with regard to corruption. So, for example, in prisons, a stable prison meets your target. But a stable prison is often the most corrupt prison, and it's stable precisely because it is corrupt. Prisoners get their drugs and their mobile phones and they're happy and they don't riot. Well, that's not what society wants from the prison. So, you know, targets can be problematic there. I think in the private sector, that there is an emerging sort of more subtle understanding, and Philippa will know more than I do about this, of how bad targets can drive very unethical behaviour. Sometimes not necessarily because the individual wants that, but because that's the targets have been set very badly, particularly on remuneration. And to give an example, if you're the sales manager in a country where corruption is highly prevalent, and you're set a target by people above you which says, you know, you've got to achieve certain sales targets or you don't get a bonus, then your temptation might be to pay bribes to do that. So there has to be something that says you get rewarded if you decide not to break the law and not to pay a bribe. You can still get your bonus. But so there's a more subtle understanding now, I think, about that kind of way in which remuneration can drive poor performance or good performance. And on that good performance thing, I was very interested. When I went into the city about 10 years ago, we often, as an institutional investor, used to ask the question of companies, how much of your senior executives' remuneration is linked to non-financial issues? So in an extractive company, for instance, to health and safety performance. And generally it was a very, very low proportion. I mean, something like 10%, perhaps 20% for the very, very best companies at that time, 10 years ago. I asked the same question of one of the world's largest extractive companies about 3 weeks ago. What proportion of their senior management's or senior executives' pay was linked to directly to financial performance as opposed to these other indicators. Only 40% in that company was now linked directly to financial performance, and the rest was what it previously would have been regarded like the soft targets like environmental performance, health and safety and so on. So I think there is a very positive change amongst some of those companies going on. And can I just mention health while we're on that? I don't particularly want to comment on staff because I don't know the situation very well, but one of the most depressing things for me coming into Transparency International 5 years ago was the understanding I gained that corruption in healthcare, not particularly in the UK but worldwide, is one of the biggest issues. And it is doctors, people who have signed the Hippocratic Oath, who are often most culpable in this, in hospitals in developing countries, who will simply not operate unless they are given a bribe. Despite the fact that they are being paid a salary by the state and so on. I mean, it's really a horrendous picture in healthcare around the world.
But important points there, that actually boards and politicians perhaps ought to be more concerned and more aware of the impact of targets and measurement and evaluation in this context than they have been, and could make a difference. Sorry, Ken, did you want to go in?
Just maybe a slight point. Slightly in defense of targets, especially in the private sector. I don't think targets equate with unethical behavior. I don't think targets equate with short-termism either. And I think in there's examples that you alluded to of short-termism being a problem. But and targets don't always need to be financial. Here at RICS, I'm a member of staff, and we have targets that relate to behavior. And also targets can bring clarity to people. Targets can do some good things for clarity for an organization and their staff. But I would absolutely agree that targets used in the ways that have been the examples that have been given can lead to some absolutely unethical behavior.
Yeah, I mean, there are good targets and bad targets. But just for you here, Ken, I've just got a tweet in. In this economic climate, this is from Mark Kapanda, in this economic climate, how do we compete against property firms that are not governed by RICS?
How do we compete against property firms that are not going by RICS? Well, if I relate that question to the international standards work that I mentioned, with these international standards, there's a market need for them. There's a market need for them. So if you think of a property deal, there is an advantage to being able to compare numbers. There's an advantage to being able to produce numbers that can be comparable and transparent. And so there's an advantage to that. And so I think the direct answer to the question is if there's somebody in a commercial competitive situation that is using the standards that RICS supports and implements, they will have a competitive advantage. And if they do it well, they'll have more of an advantage. And so in a situation where maybe there's, I guess a macro situation would be an international investor who's deciding to purchase a shopping center in either Shanghai or Toronto or Beijing. And Beijing is not using the international standard, but the other two markets are. It's going to take a lot more work for that investor to get into those numbers and trust those numbers to really get to the depth of that Beijing investment. So why bother? Why bother? So I think that if there's a property firm that is not following, if you will, the international standard, there's a cost to that. And that's very much the market we want to create.
Sorry, Robert. Well, let's have another question.
I find Ken's view so interesting. I'm Mark Dunn, I'm a receiver, that's for ICS. One of the problems is that we're in a hyper-competitive, hyper-transaction environment. What the ICS know, people deliberately mixed up concepts of price and transaction with value all the time in their ICS. There's not control because of the sheer hyper-competitive nature of the environment and the intensity of profitability and transaction, and there is unethical behaviour happening every day around this concept deliberately. Your comments?
I had trouble hearing some of the words you made, but I think you referred to unethical behavior around price.
What I'm saying is we're in a very hyper-competitive commercial environment, which is very transactional.
Yes.
And there's deliberate manipulation of concepts of price and value. So we're not really dealing with rainbow valuations anymore, we're dealing with transactional price ideas. And many surveying practices are doing this, including my own to some extent. And it's a lot of distortion and deception, manipulation. That's unethical. But it's a sheer pressure competition.
Yeah, I take your point. I wouldn't equate pressure competition with, I think, the clear unethical behavior you're referring to. I think that they might relate, and maybe you have some good examples of that, but I don't think they're directly related or necessarily the same thing. I can take your point, and I'm sure you have some good examples of that. I'm not going to say that you're wrong, but.
I was in this debate the other day when people were arguing about, well, regulation can be an issue, targets can be an issue. Surely at the end of the day, and I think one of you said this, individuals have got to take a decision about what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do. And you can't use the systems and you can't use the targets as an excuse. And you can't use competition as an excuse, can you? And that's where I mentioned at the outset, we haven't really talked about it. I mean, the issue of education seems to me to be pretty damn important, that we do help people, young people in particular, to develop a sense of what is decent and what is right. Is that just pretentious rubbish, or is it important, Robert? Should we be doing more of it? How do you do it?
Well, I think we certainly should. But can I also just come back on that point about what happens if you're competing against unethical companies? And this is a real issue, I think, that one shouldn't underplay in the global economy when one sees emerging markets companies which are operating to very, very difficult ethical standards in other emerging markets. And the cliche that is usually unveiled is Chinese companies operating in Africa. And to some extent it's a cliche, but to some extent it's sadly true. How do you compete against that company if you're a European company which is trying to operate to higher standards? And I think we can't duck the fact that that is extremely hard, and you might actually lose business if you want to operate ethically. And I suppose one thing, when one's talking about the sort of personal ethics aspect in this, I get a little bit depressed if the debate about ethics gets reduced solely to a business case and trying to make the case, you know, I'm going to make more money as a company if I am more ethical. That may not be the case, but you will be a better and nicer company if you are more ethical, and that should be what motivates and inspires people.
Please.
Thank you. Again, I'm very grateful for the opportunity of listening to a fascinating debate, and I think there have been some really interesting points that have intrigued me and I've found very thought-provoking. One of the things I'm interested in is ethics over a period. I'm fascinated by the point about the question that's asked as to whether we think people are behaving more ethically than they were 10 years ago, not least because as a small p politician in my spare time, I find quite often that people generally think everything is getting worse almost irrespective of evidence to the contrary. But I am intrigued and taking up President-elect's speciality, and one that I do in my day job, which is planning. Of course, we had some spectacular scandals, Poulsen being just one, which really sort of coloured, I think, everyone's view about local government and planning in particular. And of course, it's quite fascinating to think that although we tend to think of local government as rather incompetent, and occasionally in relation perhaps to some of the social care scandals as very seriously incompetent to the point of perhaps negligence, it does seem to me that actually some element of that local government corruption seems to have been eliminated without anyone really paying very much attention as to what did it. And I wondered if the panel had any thoughts on that.
Yes. You obviously haven't worked in central government, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, by coincidence, TI published a report last week called Corruption in Local Government, the Mounting Risks. So I do have a view on it, which is, I mean, we found in our research there's a very interesting mismatch between the proven cases of corruption in local government, which have tended to come through legal cases, and what the public thinks happens. And basically the public think local government is pretty corrupt. But there are not a very large number of cases that have come through. Now that may mean there's not much corruption going on, it may mean it's just not coming out, and, you know, who knows, but there's clearly a mismatch. And so what we looked at actually was what are the kind of institutional defences against corruption. And for those of you who are familiar with local government, you'll know that a sort of quite a rigorous and well-staffed standards regime was put in place about 10 years ago, standards for England and so on, and that's been abolished by the new government. And likewise, the sort of 150-year-old tradition of the Audit Commission is being abolished right now, with the localism bill going through through Parliament at the moment, as Lord Bichard will know. I'm sure he's looked at that in the Lords. So our view is there's a mounting risk, because, you know, irrespective of how much corruption has existed in local government, it's likely to get worse because some of the defences are being stripped away. And one of the few things you have in these cases, when I mean, corruption is always very, very difficult to spot. Everybody has an interest in keeping it under the radar and not surfacing it. So the best you can have is good defences against it as a deterrent and to try and bring it out where it's happening. And at the moment in local government, one sees that these defences are being stripped away, not deliberately to allow corruption to happen, but that's the net effect, because people don't think with a sort of corruption hat on in the way that TI tends to. These things happen for other reasons, and then you see, my goodness, we've created an environment in which corruption really could thrive. And so probably in 10 years, we'll see there's been a load of scandals, and we'll put back something like Standards for England in the way these things happen. But it's rather a shame that we had to go through that 10-year of agony to put that into place.
Well, I think it's a great question, and since it's one of my specialist subjects, perhaps I could be allowed a contribution, and it will be very much supporting what you said. I mean, I moved amendments in the House to ensure that local authorities still have to have a code of ethics.
Precisely, that's one of the extraordinary things.
And in the end, you know, we got that through. But I was just flabbergasted that the government were just taking away that explicit statement of what people have the right to expect from their local elected body, because I think things had improved. I don't know it was because of the Code of Ethics, but I think things had improved very significantly. And local government, I think I was writing something a couple of weeks ago, I think local government in some ways is a shining example in the democratic process now. But for heaven's sake, don't sort of take your foot off the pedal. Don't sort of say, well, it's no longer necessary for you to have an explicit statement of what you stand for and how you're going to behave. I think someone earlier said, actually, I think it was you, Philippa, but that's really quite important. It does have an impact that people have got a statement of what they should be applying.
Duncan Preston, a fellow of the RICS. My question is about the other half of having ethics and how you police it, or maybe police is the wrong word, but a toothless granny isn't very effective. And how in a business which has a code do you actually deal with the exercise of that code if it's found to be broken?
And I'll hand that over to them, but I have to say that also has gone from the world of local government. There was a very strong regime of sanctions applied alongside the Code of Ethics. That's gone as well. But a broader question.
Yes. Well, many companies are now looking very much more at this sort of subject, and actually many more are actually reporting publicly on what they're doing. For instance, there are a number of companies who will now report in their CR reports. We're hoping under integrated reporting it'll come through to the main annual reports. But they're actually reporting how many cases of misconduct there have been, what trends there might have been, and how many people have actually been let go or made, sacked, basically, for misconduct under the Code of Ethics. And there are about half a dozen companies, because I was looking this up only last week. GSK is one, British BAE, Diageo and BP were the four that I was looking at last week, where they all report these sorts of figures. And some of the numbers in terms of people raising queries under their speak-up lines, as we tend to call it, rather than whistleblowing, because it's whistleblowing so negative. They're very high numbers, 400 to 500. Now, you might say that's not very many for the size of companies, but they're going to great lengths trying always to refresh people's knowledge of those ways and mechanisms. But that's a formal speaking up process. Companies will always encourage people to actually raise concerns directly with their line manager. It's only if they can't do it that route that they tend to end up using the more formal mechanisms.
It's a fairly optimistic view, taken, Philippa, isn't it? I mean, I said that we've got people sitting in the laws who shouldn't be there because they fiddle their expenses. There are lots of people who are directors of companies in this country who I don't think should be there.
Well,
I mean, it's a toothless tiger, isn't it? Because people don't want to actually target them because somehow it's not on.
Well, I was reporting from the context of within companies, are they getting rid of people for unethical behaviour? And the answer is yes. Some have even written their, lack of adherence to the Code of Ethics as actually being part of the employee contract, and therefore it is a sackable offence if they don't behave. So I was talking about it in that context. I think where you come to whether or not you're going to strike off a director, or whether that's at one level, under the legal level, or are investors going to start getting rid of directors? Well, that would really be throwing their clout around, which I think, under stewardship codes and things, they ought to be thinking of.
Okay. Could I just mention something on there, since Philippa mentioned BAE as a company doing well. For me, it's a good example of reporting well. For me, it's a good example of a company which has handled its very well publicised corruption issues quite badly. And the reason I say that is not because I know much about their internal systems and procedures. By the way, if there are any lawyers in the room, I may need your help after this. I think there are 2 points there. The first is that the company has never admitted corruption. It was fined $450 million for so-called books and records offences That sounds like a farce. I say sounds like, I'll use words like allegedly, but you all know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's astonishing that a major British company can be fined $450 million by the British courts and American courts and somehow not be pleading guilty to what we all know is the issue on the table. I think if companies themselves are in denial, if the leadership are in denial, there's no hope that people elsewhere in the company are really going to be able to act as ethically as we want them to. And the second point there is that even if you accept a case in which a company is fined $450 million for books and record offences, to me that sounds like very poor bookkeeping. Now, who has been held responsible for that? Where is the director who's been held up and fired for that? We don't see that. So I think, I really think corporate leaders have got to step up to the plate here, and the kind of cosy cronyism amongst the boardrooms has got to be broken through a little bit, and people have got to admit it when they've got it wrong, and be prepared to point the finger at the people who were responsible.
And there was me trying to avoid the word cronyism, but thank you very much for bringing it here. One of the disadvantages of these things is you start getting messages like, will you please draw this event to a close? Which is the last one I got. So I always do what I'm told. I'm well known for it, so I will draw the event to a close. But I think this is a discussion which could have gone on for a very long time. I just want to say at the end, so that we don't just forget about these things, I think some really important points made about standards, about transparency, obviously, about enforcement and whether we're getting that right and whether we're applying sanctions sufficiently, whether or not legislation really does make a difference. The really, really important issue of leadership, which is either a very positive or a negative influence on any organisation, or indeed on countries too. The pressure of targets and regulation, which maybe boards and politicians should be more aware of, and I will not let it go. I think the importance of basic education in developing people who have a strong set of personal ethics. All of those, and I'm sure many more, are very important issues to take away and carry on discussing. I would just want to say thank you so much to the panel and to you for coming. Thank you very much.
I'd like to also thank Lord Bichard for chairing that. It's a shame we haven't got longer, actually. So to the panel, Lord Bichard, thank you very, very much for coming. There were some key words that came through the whole event. You've said them all, so I'm not going to repeat those. But what I thought was interesting was the fact that I've got social media, increased legislation as a baseline, whistleblowers, I know you call them something else, and the like, are resulting in a diminishing ability to get away with unethical behaviour or corruption, which is an odd way of looking at it. But as the world is getting more transparent and the global approach is what we are all involved in, there's fewer places to hide. That can't be a bad thing. That's got to be a good thing. So that's the point that I've taken away with this. So lots to ponder, lots to take home with us. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and can we thank everybody involved in the normal way. Thanks very much.